what assumptions do we need to put aside? And I think that there's one assumption that we might well look at, and that is a sort of a consensus view of meritocracy in organizations. That there is some sort of natural process by which the best rise to the top and lead us towards some kind of a future. And I think that with what's been happening over the last, certainly in my lifetime, I've seen a separation of oil and water that has been happening. And the oil has been getting thicker, and the water has been getting thinner and more rarefied, and further and further and further away from the oil. And that's what seems to be happening at the moment. And I think that we are generationally getting to a place where meritocracy may not be possible for many people. The natural rise may not be possible for those who are uneducated, unprovided, and under-resourced to a level where they're no longer players in the game. Am I making sense? There's a sense that we are now at a place of epochal change, whatever is coming. But we are at a place of a tipping point. And beyond that, and of course, AI is important, and of course, the shifts that are going to happen, as they were 350 years ago at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But what I'm aware of is that the social changes that have come about in the period of this emergence of the communications revolution, there are people who are just not able. And that really worries me, because that's a loss of talent, firstly, but it also implies a meritocracy which isn't real anymore. And I think we need to address that. So in the past, those situations have worked into pretty unhealthy environments. So that's my point.
And actually, William, was the meritocracy ever valid?
I think I'm with you. Yes, I think I might be with you there. Yeah.
I think it was designed in a certain way
yes,
for a dominant
absolutely.
group to control and everyone else to get bits.
Yeah.
I think that's the case for sure.
I was actually very, very moved by what Stein, have I got the pronunciation of your name right, Stein? Stein, thank you. I was very moved by what Stein said, reading Steinbeck and reminding me of the grinding horror of my parents' generation. I'm just a little bit older than the rest of you. My parents' generation lived that 10 years, a decade of grinding horror. And there are people in the Far East who are less than that away from that, you know, in terms of time. And I would hate to think that we would lose all the advantages that we've gained. But there we are. That's where we are. But I was very moved by what you were saying, because your thinking seems to be informed by that reading. So anyway, there we are.
It has to be. But also, I really, what you just said about, you've said it much nicer than I could ever say about rising inequalities and this meritocracy. I think we call it sometimes kicking away the ladder or things like this, where it becomes very difficult for people to grab opportunities that are out there. I mean, just to give you one example of research that we've recently done at the OECD, where we're looking at a phenomenon called domestic outsourcing. So what is this? These are jobs that used to typically be done within the firm, and then they're being outsourced to another firm. So typical examples are things like cafeteria services, security services. And what we found is that generally when this happens, the working conditions and the salaries of these people deteriorate as a result. And we don't fully understand the mechanisms, but there's a very famous economist in the US who's called this the Fischer Workplace. So it's, you get the top and the bottom, the oil and the water, as you were saying. And one of the things that disappears is the ability of people within a firm to make kind of promotion and rise up the ladder. And then that's just one example of some of the things that we are seeing. But to go back to Alicia's question about assumption, I think there's two assumptions that I think we need to do away with. And I think one of them was already raised by Donna, but I want to reemphasize it. And that is that nothing about the future is inevitable. I think the future is something that we jointly decide on. It's between employers, between workers and government. We need to have a discussion about what kind of future we want. When you think about technologies, for example, it's not inevitable that we adopt certain technologies. This is a decision that we need to take as a society. Now, this decision-making process may not always work, but we need to try and make it work for everybody. And I think that's where social dialogue becomes extremely important. If we have a very effective social dialogue, we can decide what technologies are adopted, how they're adopted, and also what we do with people who lose from these technologies, how they're compensated. I think that's very important. So one assumption is nothing about the future is inevitable. The second assumption I think that's often made, and that I think is a fallacy, is that people seem to think there is some kind of trade-off between the number of jobs and the quality of jobs. And people always go on and say, well, you know, we can't pay so much, or we can't have these working conditions, we can't have this regulation because we're worried about affecting the number of jobs in the economy. Now, to some extent, that's true. But if you look at the countries that do best from a labor market perspective, they do best both in terms of job quantity and job quality. Whereas the countries that do worse in both job quantity and job quality. So I think these things go hand in hand. I mean, job quality enhances productivity, which then increases wages, which leads to higher demand for goods and services, which in turn leads to more employment. So I think these two assumptions, I think, are two things that we need to be careful with.
And I also think the idea that the grinding horror doesn't exist for hundreds of millions of people who are in work today.
That may be true, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's not a physical horror. Or maybe it's like Death of the Salesman. Maybe it's a psychological horror of being trapped in this sort of cycle of turning up and what is fundamentally routine work, which I think has been designed so that we can be automated. I think it's there to that repeated sort of stuff that humans do. Many people do it. Is patterned for automation. But while we wait that out, I think that there are people, many people who have very we're soulful with species, you know, and we commune together, and we have the social brain, and there's a lot of people that are quietly, I think, dying in work that we've created for them.
Yes, very much so.
Where is our spiritual self? It's all the existential stuff, I know, but really, I think we've spent 150 years kind of blocking that out so that industrialization has become really the driving factor of everything we do.
Yes. There's quite a lot of work that's been done, and some okay, here's an ungrounded assertion, and that is that there is quite a lot of work around the notion of the right brain and the left brain, and that there is a sort of a tyranny of the left brain, a tyranny of detail and inverted commas reason and data. Whereas the right brain is largely discounted. And as a poet, I've spent 25 years plus working in organizations where I have to tell you, my half of the brain is absolutely discounted. People think in terms of leadership through the left brain and fixing and solutions and so on, and logic and all these things, but they have lost that soulful quality. And my task in organizations has always been to bring that soulful quality to the workplace. Now, perhaps that is possible because at the moment, the extent of the swing towards the left brain is almost excluding people from a meaningful working life. Joseph Campbell used to talk about, used to say, people say we're looking for a meaning. What we're actually looking for is an experience of being alive. So that at our deepest level, we feel the rapture of being alive. Now, as you rightly say, we're not all in horror, Donna, but many of us don't have a path to the rapture. We don't have a path to the ecstatic moment of being alive. Work denies us that. And I think perhaps we need to build that back in to the very notion of work, that work can give us an experience that is better than we might even have hoped for.